The American Story, The Beginnings, by David Barton and Tim Barton, as read by Karl Hirsch. The American Story highlights some of the interesting moments and people that reveal God's providence in America. We have a fascinating history that must be remembered and passed on to future generations.
Section 2, The Colonial Period.
Chapter 5, Reverend George Whitefield and the First Great Awakening. Many early colonists were sincerely pious and devout, especially in the northern colonies. But each generation must decide for itself whether to obey and follow God's word. It is a sad truth of both history and human nature that just because something begins in a good manner does not mean it will remain that way. By the time Georgia was founded in the 1730s, well over a century after the first colonies, America was experiencing a definite lull in genuine biblical practice. The Reverend Jonathan Edwards affirmed that Massachusetts was in a, quote, degenerate time, end quote, with, quote, dullness of religion, end quote. And in Pennsylvania, the Reverend Samuel Blair, who later became chaplain of Congress, likewise acknowledged that, quote, religion lay as it were dying and ready to expire its last breath of life in this part of the visible church, end quote. In only a few short generations, the excitement and enthusiasm of a vibrant Christian life had departed from many Americans and their churches. A spiritual reset was needed, and it happened. Known as the First Great Awakening, a series of revivals swept America from the 1730s through the 1760s. This occurred because of the hard work and leadership of many notable ministers, including Jonathan Edwards, a Congregationalist, as well as William Tennent and Samuel Davies, both Presbyterians, who helped set the colonies aflame spiritually. Perhaps the best-known minister of that awakening was the Reverend George Whitefield, an Anglican minister who is considered one of the founders of Methodism. For 34 years, he traveled throughout the American colonies and Europe, preaching some 18,000 times and drawing huge crowds in churches, streets, and open fields. Amazingly, an estimated 80% of all Americans heard him preach. And of course, this was at a time when neither mass media nor advanced technology was available. He simply visited that many communities. A 1739 article reported a typical local schedule for Whitefield. On Friday last, the Reverend Mr. Whitefield arrived here, Philadelphia, with his friends from New York, where he preached 8 times, and on his return hither, preached at Elizabethtown, New Jersey, Brunswick, Maidenhead, Trenton, Neshaminy, and Abingdon. He has preached twice every day in the church to great crowds, except Tuesday, when he preached at Germantown, Pennsylvania, from a balcony to about 5,000 people in the street. And last night, the crowd was so great to hear his farewell sermon on leaving Philadelphia that the church could not contain one half, whereupon they withdrew to Society Hill, where he preached from a balcony to a multitude computed at not less than 10,000 people. He left this city today and is to preach at Chester, tomorrow at Willingstown, Saturday at Newcastle, Sunday at White Clay Creek, and so proceed on his way to Georgia, through Maryland, Virginia, and Carolina. A week later, the paper gave the follow-up on the meetings it had mentioned. The Reverend Mr. Whitefield preached there in Chester to about 7,000. On Friday, he preached at Willingstown to about 5,000. On Saturday at Newcastle, and the same evening at Christian Bridge on Sunday at White Clay Creek. He preached twice, resting about half an hour between the sermons to about 8,000 people, of whom about 3,000, it is computed, came on horseback. And though it rained most of the time, yet they patiently stood in the open air. He then proceeded on his journey, preaching to multitudes wherever he went. Whitefield maintained a grueling travel and speaking schedule in countless locations across the nation. Additionally, many other local ministers were also active in their state and regions throughout that time of the awakening. As a result, thousands converted to Christianity and churches were filled. Today, this movement is often characterized as a national revival. However, it was really thousands of local revivals in so many communities across America that eventually the entire nation was changed. That is, the revival grew from families and towns outward to the nation, not from the nation inward to towns and families. During this time, founding father Benjamin Franklin developed a closer friendship with the Reverend George Whitefield. Franklin appreciated the positive impact the revival had in his hometown of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, reporting, "It was wonderful to see the change soon made in the manners of our inhabitants. From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families of every street." Now, the Reverend Jonathan Edwards similarly saw positive effects in his community of Northampton, Massachusetts. He said, "There has been vastly more religion kept up in the town among all sorts of persons, in religious exercises and in common conversation. There has been a great alteration among the youth of the town with respect to revelry, frolicking, profane and licentious conversation, and lewd songs. And there has also been a great alteration amongst both old and young with regard to tavern hunting. There has also been an evident alteration with respect to a charitable spirit to the poor." Godliness swept the colonies, and a renewed love for the Bible and its teachings grew among citizens and families in local communities across the nation. Whitefield had a substantial impact on America by changing the lives and thinking of countless Americans. It is estimated that the total number of those who attended his meetings was well over 10 million, and his message transformed hundreds of thousands. Now, since America only had 3 million inhabitants at the time, not only did most Americans hear Whitefield preach, but many likely heard him several times. One man directly impacted by Whitefield was John Morant. Born as a free black in New York in 1755. His father died while John was young. When he was 11, his mother sent him to Charleston, South Carolina, to live with an older sister and learn a trade. But after arriving, John had a change of heart, reporting, "I passed by a school and heard music and dancing, which took my fancy very much, and I felt a strong inclination to learn the music. I went home and informed my sister that I would rather learn to play upon music than go to a trade." By the time John was 13, he had mastered the violin and the French horn, and was hired to play events all over the city. He was so successful that by his own account, "I was a stranger to want, being supplied with as much money as I had occasion for." One evening, while he and a friend were on their way to play at an event, John noticed a large crowd at a meeting house with a, quote, "a crazy man hallowing there," end quote. The crazy man was the Reverend George Whitefield, preaching at one of his many meetings in the First Great Awakening. John's friend wanted to disrupt the gathering and dared John to take his French horn and blow it among them. Morant accepted the challenge. While raising the horn to his lips and preparing to blow, Whitefield suddenly looked at John, pointing his finger at him, and announced, "Prepare to meet thy God, O Israel." That's Amos 4:12. Morant immediately fell prostrate, as though struck down, remaining motionless for almost half an hour. After the meeting, Whitefield was brought to John and told him, "Jesus Christ has got thee at last." Whitefield was leaving town the next day, but told John he would send a minister to meet with him. Morant was taken to his sister's house, where he remained ill for 3 days. On the 4th day, the minister arrived. Seeing that John was afflicted, he took John's hand in his and began to pray. After the prayer, he asked John how he felt. John told him he felt worse. So the minister reasoned they should pray again. John felt even worse and wondered if the preacher was trying to kill him. The minister said they should pray a 3rd time, and this time John became, quote, "well and happy," end quote. For the next several days, the minister spiritually mentored John, encouraging him to read the Bible. Morant became extremely passionate about his newfound faith and wanted his family to share that experience with him. But they became hostile and began to persecute him. By his own testimony, they, quote, "called me every name except that which was good," end quote. So John fled into the woods, where he met a Cherokee warrior. The two spent the next 10 weeks hunting together and becoming friends. John also learned to speak Cherokee. When they had returned to the Indians' camp, Morant was made a prisoner and sentenced to death. Cherokee law demanded that any outsider to the camp be killed. They explained to him in detail how he would die. "The executioner showed me a basket full of turpentine wood, stuck full of small pieces like skewers. He told me I was to be stripped naked and laid down in the basket, and these pegs were to be stuck into me and then set on fire. And when they had burnt to my body, I was to be turned on the other side and served in the same manner, and then to be taken by 4 men and thrown into the flame, which was to finish the execution." When the Cherokees seized John to execute him, he fell to his knees and began to pray and praise God in their language. His prayers had a dramatic effect. And the executioner, the judge, and finally the chief, whom John called the king, came to believe in Jesus. John reported, "The king himself was awakened spiritually, and the others set at spiritual liberty. A great change took place among the people. The king's house became God's house. The soldiers were ordered away, and the poor condemned prisoner, Morant, had perfect liberty and was treated like a prince. Now the Lord made all my enemies become my great friends." After being released from his captivity, the chief granted Morant freedom to evangelize among his tribe, which he did for the next 9 weeks. Then, with the chief's blessing and 50 Cherokee warriors accompanying him as bodyguards, Morant traveled to the Creek tribe to preach to them, then the Catwa tribe, and finally the Hausa. He became the first Black American to successfully evangelize Native Americans, and he did so at the age of 14. It is evident that George Whitefield substantially impacted America by transforming thousands of lives, including that of John Morant, and also those John subsequently reached. But Whitefield also had a significant influence in preparing Americans for the approaching War for Independence, especially by helping break down the rigid barriers that separated the colonies from one another. Those early colonies were not like today's states with the United States. At that time, they behaved much more like separate nations of Europe. Many did not like the others, and each was largely independent, having its own currency, separate militias. They even had armed conflict among themselves over borders, such as the 8 years of skirmishes between Pennsylvania and Maryland that became known as the Criceps War, 1730 to 1738. There were similar conflicts between New York and her neighbors, as well as Virginia and hers. Another point of vigorous dispute between the colonies was over religion. All were Christian, but Pennsylvania tended to be predominantly Quaker, Virginia and South Carolina, Anglican, Massachusetts and Connecticut, Congregational, New York, Dutch Reformed, and so forth. Some of these Christian denominations were aggressively hostile toward the others, as in Virginia, where Anglicans would imprison, fine, and punish Quaker, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and other Christians who preached in their colony without approval from the state. Sadly, the American colonies had slowly begun to adopt some of the same deplorable aspects of Europe's religious tyranny from which so many had earlier fled. It was in this atmosphere of colonial disputes that Whitefield ministered. What message could he share that would be acceptable from one colony to the next? What could he do to break down the walls that separated them? How could he help them see they had more in common than different? Whitefield's Father Abraham's sermon provided an answer. Many founding fathers heard its unifying message, which challenged their thinking and remained in their minds across the years. John Adams recounted this particular sermon to his friend, Thomas Jefferson, describing how Whitefield pretended to be at the gates of heaven talking with Abraham. He, Whitefield, began, "Father Abraham," with his hands and eyes gracefully directed to the heavens, as I have more than once seen him. "Father Abraham, whom have you there with you? Have you Catholics?" "No." "Have you Protestants?" "No." "Have you churchmen, Anglicans?" "No." "Have you dissenters, Congregationalists?" "No." "Have you any Presbyterians?" "No." "Quakers?" "No." "Anabaptists?" Those are the Amish and Mennonites. "No." "Well, whom have you there? Are you alone?" "No." My brethren, you have the answer to all these questions in the words of my next text. "He who feareth God and worketh righteousness shall be accepted of him." Acts 10:35. In another account of that sermon recorded by an earlier historian, Whitefield closed by urging, quote, "God help us all to forget party names and to become Christians in deed and in truth." Whitefield's theme was unity. That despite the many different denominations and points of strong doctrinal disagreement between them, there nevertheless was the crucially important fact that they were all Christians. Whitefield preached this sermon many times throughout the colonies, and years after his death, the founding fathers found themselves in a situation that allowed them to put its message to practical use. But more on that in subsequent chapters. Whitefield's contributions in laying the foundation for American independence were substantial, and many other ministers also exerted significant influence.